This last discussion dealing with corporations, it has to do with general corporations, that is, has to do with merger and acquisition. I believe that this discussion is important, is vital, that all business students understand the nature of merger and acquisition, primarily because businesses are out there buying and selling each other all the time. If a company that's a competitor to your company is doing well, but the shareholders aren't leveraged properly or whatever, it might be that you want to buy a majority share out of that company and then begin to take over your competitor, buying up its assets, and then beginning to think about a merger. Because if you have the majority of the ownership of your competitor corporation, it could be then that those votes in that company are enough to say, let's sell this company, make more money in selling it to the other company that wanted to merge. So merger and acquisition is vital to understand. On the other side, it is also so complicated, and this is in the book just a superficial review, that I don't tend to test on it. I don't tend to even have projects on this one. There are a few cases perhaps that we can deal with, but generally speaking, this material is so complicated at this stage, and we're just at a junior level of college, that I don't really get into the details. This is for students in their master's program. Typically speaking, in an MBA, you'll have Masters of Business Administration. You'll have an opportunity to take a number of these classes, and specifically you'll have one class just dedicated to mergers and acquisitions. Here, though, I want to point out a few items just for curiosity, just for the sake of what's going on. There are different definitions of what merger means or consolidation means, and I think the PowerPoint and the book does a very good job, which you can study and understand on your own. The big issue is notice. First off, if there's going to be a purchase of a stock, or an individual says, I want to get out or whatever, you want to take a freeze frame snapshot. Slide 7 talks about an appraisal right. So that once the shareholder makes a demand for, hey, pay me out or whatever, the company then will basically do an evaluation. And the valuation is critical because that establishes what the company thinks it's worth. It's the basis for any legal liability later if there were problems, such as a breach of contract for that shareholder or whatever it is. There's all sorts of things that can come out of the valuation. But basically, the appraisal rights, when they're triggered, stop the company's motion, so to speak, and they freeze frame, take a snapshot of the company's value at that moment, and the valuation is the critical issue for that individual. How much is indeed the company worth? Because that becomes, as I said, the point where everything else derives. So on slide 10, for instance, the potential liability and purchase of assets. The book says, the slide says here, a buying company is not liable for the selling companies, the seller's liabilities, unless they impliedly or explicitly agree. That's true, but that's also in a way of saying anybody buying a company is going to say, we are picking up your liabilities. What this is really saying is that when you buy anything, you buy its good and its bad. So implied in buying a car that you bought is I buy up the bad muffler, I buy up the poorly performing carburetor, I also buy the good tires, I also buy the engine that's got life. I buy the good and the bad, and it's implied or express. So when would that not be the case? And that's basically when a company is buying up, says, well, you have a contract liability to this whatever supplier of parts, and if anything, we think that contract is not valid, we don't believe that we're buying that. Or it might be that the company splits off, there can be a particular side of the business that will survive the sale. So in other words, the seller's not selling all, and there's a liability that the seller wants to maintain, which is a contract supplying parts or whatever. So again, don't think that you don't buy up the negative with the positive. You always buy up the negative with the positive in a merger and an acquisition. It's rare that you don't, but it can happen where you don't, and that's what this slide is saying. There is something else here, a few other things. Tender offers, not going to get too much into for public offerings and private offerings. But I want to mention that the companies can dissolve both voluntarily and involuntarily. The involuntary one is the more, I think, interesting one where the state dissolves it. So let's go back to an idea that I didn't address in chapter 36. The entity that you're creating is a new person that is birthed by you through the state agreeing. The state, in other words, is the source of authority. The ultimate original source is the state to give the company life. So in other words, all companies start at some form of a state agreeing to let it breathe. By the way, there are such things as federal companies. There are things like the Veterans Affairs Administration, Foreign Wars, Legion, the American Legion, for instance. Those are federal corporations, but they're very rare. So 99.9% of all companies came to life, birthed through a state process. And so the state can create it, the state can also dissolve it. Why? Because the company failed to pay taxes, they failed to do their shareholder directors meetings and then use that as their annual reports. They just didn't keep up with the paperwork, or they abused their powers, or as I said earlier, the company directed criminal activity. And so there is something that can be done to a corporation that is failing in various ways, which is the state can dissolve it. It's a very large step for the state. It's a very big step, but it can happen, and I've seen it happen a number of times, actually. So this ends our discussion on chapter 38, and again, I've not gotten into the details with 38 for a lot of reasons, as I said here, but if you have specific questions, don't hesitate to email me.